Okay, here we have toolkit functions. These are extremely important to know and keep track of as we move along through the course. We have the name of the toolkit function, the function, and the graph of its function. So the name of a function, when we have a constant, f of x is going to equal c, where c is the constant. And when you graph something that's in this form, it's going to graph a horizontal line. So for example, if we wanted to graph this, we would pick values for x to be -2, 0, and 2. So -2 has an output of 2, 0 has an output of 2, and 2 has an output of 2. And therefore, the 2 would represent c. C would be the constant in this case. Then we have an identity graph. An identity graph, we have f of x, which is equal to x. Now you can see that this line is passing through the origin. So at -2, we have an output of -2. -2, down -2. At 0, we have an output of 0. And at 2, we have +2. So this represents an identity function. Then we have the absolute value function. F of x, which is equal to the absolute value of x. If we plug in -2 into the absolute value of x, we get +2. So when we graph that, we get -2 and then up 2. When we put in 0, the absolute value of 0 is 0. So we have 0, 0 at the origin. We plug in 2, we get the absolute value of 2 is +2, so we have 2. So when we have an absolute value function, it's going to graph a v. Then we have a quadratic function. Quadratic function, f of x is equal to x squared. If we plug in the values for x to be -2 and we'll square it, we get an output of 4. So -2 and then up 4. If we put a -1 in for x and square it, we get +1. So -1 and then up 1. If we put in 0 in for x and square it, we get 0. So we have 0, 0. If we put in +1 and square it, we get 1. So we get 1, 1. And we put in +2 and square it, we get 4. So we have 2 and 4. So this is a quadratic function. Then we have a cubic function, f of x, which is equal to x cubed. So each value of x that we plug in, we have to cube it. If we cube -1, we get -1 as the output. If we cube -0.5, we get -0.125. If we cube 0, then we're going to get 0, 0.5 to 0.125, 1, and then 1. And when we graph that, this is what the graph looks like of a cubic function. Next, what we have is a reciprocal function, f of x, which is equal to 1 divided by x. So when we plug in the value of x, then what is the output? Well, if we put -2 in the denominator, that becomes -1/2, which is the same thing as -0.5. If I put -1 in for x, we get 1 divided by -1, which is -1. And as we continue to move along, we have this reciprocal function. So here, okay, we can't go across that the origin part of this graph. So you can see here that this is a reflection. So if I did graph an imaginary line here and then folded the page, it would be right on top of each other. So this is a reciprocal function. Then we have a reciprocal squared function, f of x, which is equal to 1 over x squared. If we plug in the values of x for each value, and the output's going to give us the following, it's going to give us this particular function. And again, if I draw a line down the vertical axis and fold the page, it's going to be right on top of each other. Then we have the square root function. The square root function, there are your inputs and your outputs, and your square root function is going to look like the following. Then we have a cube root function. If we take the cube root of a value of x, then we're going to have this cube root graph. And again, here's your input and your output. So you want to make sure that you understand what each of these particular functions look like according to their standard graphs.